I've told this story enough times now that I can feel the memory pressing smooth, the way a hot iron settles a stubborn wrinkle out of good wool. But I remember that morning clearly, because Victoria had just been rinsed clean by a night of rain, and for once the whole city smelled like wet stone and possibility instead of coal smoke. I was 17. I thought I understood my father completely. I want you to remember that particular kind of confidence, because I certainly haven't forgotten how it felt to lose it.
The shop was already alive with movement by the time I came downstairs, my father humming something tuneless under his breath, the way he always does when he's satisfied with his own work. 3 deliveries sat laid out across the cutting table, like a general reviewing troops. Mr. Fletcher's reinforced harbor coat, sturdy enough to survive another decade of dock work in the worst weather Victoria could throw at it. Julian Ashcomb's new navy suit, finished the night before by lamplight, and the long-awaited emerald dress for a Mrs. Abigail Whitmore, wrapped in paper so carefully it looked more like a gift than an invoice, which, knowing my father, might have been exactly the point.
My father ran a hand along the navy suit's lining, checking a seam only he would ever notice had been slightly imperfect 2 days earlier. Every delivery, he told me, was the shop walking out that door wearing our name, whether we happened to be standing there or not. I nodded like I understood completely. Then he peeled back the lining to show me a hidden pocket he'd sewn into Julian's jacket, tucked exactly where no tailor in this city would ever think to look for it. That, he said, without a trace of pride in his voice, is our craftsmanship talking, not our mouths. I filed it away as one more strange little Alder Blackwell saying. I did not yet know how many of those sayings were actually instructions, quietly waiting for me to be old enough to use them. I carried the 3 parcels out into the gray district myself, and the first stop, same as always, was Mrs. Finch's flower stall. She pressed a small bundle of forget-me-nots into my hand before I'd even said good morning, told me they were for luck, and reminded me, as she reminded everyone, that luck was mostly just paying attention, wearing a nicer coat. I laughed. I didn't understand yet how right she was. Gideon the baker waved me down for a warm roll I hadn't asked for, same as every morning of my life. But it was old Mrs. Bell, waiting patient on a bench outside his shop, who said the thing I still think about. She told me our family had earned 40 years of trust in this district, one honest stitch at a time. And that kind of trust, once you have it, is the only currency that never once loses its value. I remember thinking that was a lovely thing to say. I did not yet understand it was also a warning. Past the gray district, the streets turned to iron, foundries breathing smoke, forges hammering out sparks and long orange arcs, a rail depot rattling with cargo nobody bothers to name out loud. My father has a rule about the iron district, one he must have told me 100 times growing up above that shop. It rewards a very particular kind of attention, not what you see first, what doesn't belong in the picture at all. I walked in that morning with Mr. Fletcher's coat tucked under one arm, whistling, feeling entirely too pleased with myself for a boy who was about to be handed a pop quiz he didn't know he'd signed up for.
There was a man standing near the depot gate in a factory supervisor's coat, and every single thing about him was wrong, in a way I couldn't immediately name. His boots were spotless in a district that eats boots alive by breakfast. Not one speck of soot on him, anywhere, in air thick enough with it to taste. And when the light caught his waistcoat just right, I saw a pocket watch that likely cost more than this entire street earns in a season. He caught me staring, tipped his hat with a small, unhurried smile like we shared a private joke, and simply melted into the crowd before I could decide what to do about any of it. I heard my father's voice in my head, clear as if he were standing beside me. When something feels wrong, don't waste time asking why it feels wrong. Ask instead what expectation wasn't met.
In the merchant ward, old Edgar Bellamy, the watchmaker, thanked me for Mr. Fletcher's coat like I'd personally sewn every stitch of it myself. Then, unprompted, he told me a story I'd never heard. Years ago, my father repaired his late wife's funeral dress for free, refusing every coin Edgar tried to press on him. No man should profit from another man's goodbye, my father had told him. I walked out of that shop a little heavier than I walked in, carrying a version of my father I hadn't met yet.
On Riverside Bridge, I met a girl who would rearrange the rest of my week without even trying. Evelyn Pembroke, sharp-eyed, unbothered, a satchel of medical texts slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. She looked at me for exactly 3 seconds and said, "You're a tailor's son, and you've had that coat's hem repaired more than once by someone who loves you very precisely." I hadn't said a single word yet. I decided right then that I liked her enormously. I asked how she'd known. She held up her own hands, ink-stained fingers, a small callus from constant note-taking. "Not a lady of leisure," she said, "a volunteer who writes things down for a living." Then she nodded at my coat hem, stitched in a slightly different thread than the rest, and told me only someone who loved me had bothered to match it that closely. I was, for possibly the first time in my life, the one being read instead of doing the reading. It was humbling. It was also, I'll admit, a little bit thrilling. Before we parted, Evelyn told me she volunteered at St. Aldrin's Clinic most afternoons, helping her father, and that I should visit sometime if I was ever curious how the other half of this city got stitched back together. I told her I already knew plenty about stitching things back together. She just smiled and said, "Not this kind." I thought about that the rest of the walk to the Diamond District, and honestly, I'm still thinking about it now. The Diamond District never fails to remind me how differently the same city can wear its own face depending on which street you're standing on. Marble steps, silk curtains, servants who move like they're apologizing for taking up space. I found Julian Ashcombe at his desk inside the towering Ashcombe Financial House, and when he stood to try the jacket on properly, it settled across his shoulders exactly the way my father had promised it would, like a decision he'd already made and simply hadn't announced yet. Julian caught his own reflection in the window glass, went quiet for a second, and said, almost to himself, "I look like I actually belong at that table now." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that my father had been telling him that with fabric for weeks. As I helped him settle the jacket across his shoulders, I noticed a document, half hidden beneath a ledger, on his desk, sealed in wax the color of fresh blood, stamped with a crest I'd never once seen outside a royal proclamation. Julian shifted the ledger just enough to block it, casual as breathing, like he'd practiced the motion. Neither of us said a word about it. I've thought about that silence more times than I can count since. On Kings Avenue, a carriage sat stuck fast against the curb, its wheel jammed on a splintered cobble nobody had bothered to notice. I crouched down, found the actual snag in about 10 seconds, wedged it loose, and the whole thing rolled free clean. The gentleman inside offered me a gold eagle for my trouble. I refused it the way my father always taught me to. A kindness paid for stops being a kindness. It just becomes a transaction with better manners.
Mrs. Abigail Whitmore answered her own door, which surprised me, and when I unwrapped that emerald dress for her, she went very quiet. Her late husband had commissioned the fabric himself before he passed, she told me, wanting to see her in green one more time. She wasn't crying about the dress. She was crying because, for the first time in a long while, she remembered what it felt like to smile. She thanked my father through me, twice, like once wasn't enough to cover it.
I didn't notice him at the time, but I've had it described to me since, so clearly I can almost place myself back on that street. An elderly man on a bench across the avenue, newspaper open in his lap, hadn't turned a single page in 20 full minutes. He wasn't reading. He was watching me. I wish I could tell you I felt it, some prickle up the back of my neck. I felt absolutely nothing. That's the part that still unsettles me.
My last delivery of the day had no name on it at all, just an address, St. Aldrin's Clinic. I stood there a moment, turning it over in my hands before it clicked. It had to be for Dr. Pembroke, Evelyn's father, which meant, without a single bit of planning on my part, my day was about to circle right back around to her.
Evelyn met me at the clinic door before I'd even had the chance to knock, like she'd been expecting me, which, it turned out, she sort of had. She told me she'd recognize me on the bridge instantly because she'd been watching me for years without my ever noticing, tagging along beside her father on his supply runs through the Gray District. I'd been a small fixture in her memory long before I'd ever once registered her in mine. There's a very particular kind of vertigo in learning you've been quietly playing a supporting role in someone else's story the entire time, and never once knew you had a part.
She told me why she chose medicine, standing right there in that cramped little entryway. A doctor had treated her younger brother for free once, when her family had nothing left to offer. And she decided on the spot, young as she was, that she wanted to be able to give somebody else that exact feeling someday. I thought about Edgar Bellamy's story. I thought about my father, refusing gold eagles like they were an insult. I was starting to notice a pattern in this city that had absolutely nothing to do with wealth.
A carriage accident emergency tore through the clinic before either of us could say another word, and I watched St. Aldrin's mobilize the exact same way my father mobilizes a shop full of last-minute alterations before a wedding day. Fast, calm, nobody wasting a single motion on panic. A stretcher wheel had cracked clean through halfway down the corridor, and without really thinking it through, I pulled the leather strip I always carry, the one my father insists a person should never leave home without, and lashed it tight enough to hold the weight. Evelyn looked over at me afterward like she was quietly reconsidering something about who exactly I was. Walking home, I turned that whole day over in my head like a coin I couldn't stop flipping. Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Bell, Edgar Bellamy, Mrs. Whitmore. Every single one of them had handed me a piece of a man my father never talks about himself. It was starting to feel less like a coincidence and a lot more like a pattern he'd built on purpose, one quiet kindness at a time, and simply never bothered to sign his name to. I got home to find the shop door standing open, just slightly, just enough. My father has never once left that door open, not in 17 years, rain or shine, customers or none. I stood on the step a moment longer than I probably should have before I finally pushed it in. My father was sitting calm as still water, tea already poured for two like he'd known the exact minute I'd walk in. On the table between us sat a plain cream envelope, no crest, no return address, delivered by some young courier neither of us knew. Inside, one unsigned line, and old debt deserves old company. He read it once, folded it, and fed it straight into the stove without a flicker of hesitation. I asked why he'd burn it so fast. I only burn letters, he said, that have already served their purpose.
I told him about my day anyway, all of it, and he listened the way he always listens, like every word actually mattered. When I got to Evelyn, he asked only 2 questions. Did she ask thoughtful questions? Did she answer mine honestly? I told him yes, both times. Then she's worth speaking with again, he said. and went right back to his tea, like that settled something important. Looking back now, I think it did.
A knock came at the door after we'd already locked it for the night. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, then one final tap after that. Unhurried, deliberate, like whoever stood out there had all the time in the world and knew it. My father didn't move an inch to answer it. He just sat there in the dark, listening to the silence that followed, and said quietly, mostly to himself, that whoever stood outside had clearly expected him. Not hoped he'd be home, expected it. I asked how he could possibly know that from a knock. He said patience like that isn't guessed at. It's learned, from experience, that the wait would eventually be worth it. I didn't understand the difference then. I understand it now, and it still gives me a small chill to think about.
Later, once he thought I was asleep, my father pried up a loose floorboard beneath a cutting table and drew out a narrow iron tube I never once knew existed. Inside it, a second letter, far older than the first, yellowed soft at the edges, its wax seal still whole, still unbroken after however many years it had been sitting down there in the dark. He turned it over once in the lamplight, studied it a long moment, and did not open it. Not yet, was all he said, to absolutely no one, before he sealed the floor back over it and put out the very last flame in the house for the night. I wasn't there to see any of that, not really, not with my own eyes, but I've pieced it together since, the same way I've pieced together most of this. Inside Blackwell Tailoring, the shop slept on, same as always, and somewhere beneath its floor the past waited. Patiently. It had already been waiting a very long time, and it was, I'd learn eventually, in absolutely no hurry at all.